The Argentine conscripts called them something that doesn't translate well into English. The closest approximation is the smiling killers. 18-year-old boys from Buenos Aires and Córdoba, shivering in trenches around Port Stanley, had heard the rumours. The British were bringing Gurkhas, Nepalese soldiers who'd been fighting for the crown since 1815. Men who carried curved knives called kukris and supposedly never sheathed them without drawing blood. Most of it was myth, some of it wasn't. And on the night of 13th of June 1982, as the final battle for the Falkland Islands began on a frozen ridge called Mount Tumbledown, those Argentine conscripts were about to find out which parts were true. This is the story the Falklands documentaries rarely tell. Not the Sea Harriers, not the 21-0 kill ratio, not the ships burning in San Carlos water. This is the story of the men from Nepal who sailed 8,000 miles to fight a war that ended, according to them, too soon. To understand who was coming up that mountain, you have to go back 167 years. Nepal, a landlocked kingdom wedged between the British East India Company's territories and Tibet, smaller than most people imagine, dominated by the Himalayas. In 1814, the company went to war against the Kingdom of Nepal over border disputes and the expansion of Nepalese territory into regions the British considered theirs. The company expected a quick campaign. They had conquered most of the subcontinent. What trouble could a small mountain kingdom cause? The answer came at places like Kalanga, where 600 Nepalese soldiers held a fort against 3,500 British and Indian troops for over a month. When the fort finally fell, the British commander, Major General David Ochterlony, was so impressed by the defenders' courage that he allowed the survivors to march out with full military honours, their weapons, their colours, their dignity intact. It was an unusual gesture for colonial warfare, but the Nepalese hill fighters, collectively called Gurkhas after the former Principality of Gurkha, had earned something that transcended the usual calculus of empire. They had earned respect. The war continued for 2 years across the Himalayan foothills. British casualties mounted. The Gurkhas refused to break. They fought with a combination of ferocity and discipline that startled officers who'd campaigned across India and thought they'd seen everything the subcontinent could produce. When one Gurkha fortress fell, another would hold. When one column was destroyed, another would form. By 1816, Ochterlony had pushed deep enough into Nepalese territory to threaten the capital at Kathmandu. The kingdom sued for peace. The Treaty of Sugauli, signed on the 4th of March 1816, cost Nepal roughly a third of its territory, the regions that would become parts of modern India's hill states. But it also established something else, a relationship. The British made the Nepalese an offer. Instead of trying to conquer the kingdom outright, a prospect that would have been bloody and expensive, they asked if those fierce hill fighters might consider fighting for them instead. The first Gurkha units entered British service that same year, and they've been there ever since. By 1982, the Gurkha regiments had accumulated a combat record that few units in any army could match. The Indian Mutiny of 1857, Gurkhas remained loyal and helped retake Delhi. The trenches of the First World War, Gurkhas fought at Gallipoli in Mesopotamia on the Western Front. The jungles of Burma in the Second World War, Gurkhas conducted some of the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the Pacific Theatre. Malaya, Borneo, the Falklands would be simply the latest chapter in a story that stretched back to before Argentina even existed as a nation. The Victoria Cross statistics alone tell part of the story. 26 VCs awarded to Gurkha soldiers or officers, the highest recognition for valour in the British military system, given only for acts of extraordinary courage in the face of the enemy. The citations read like something from mythology. Single soldiers charging machine gun positions, men continuing to fight after being wounded multiple times, sacrifices that saved entire units at the cost of individual lives. But numbers don't capture what makes a Gurkha. The selection process in Nepal is legendary because it has to be. Every year, thousands of young Nepalese men, sometimes 28,000 applicants for roughly 200 positions, compete for the chance to join the British Brigade of Gurkhas. The physical tests begin with the Doko race, a brutal hill run carrying a wicker basket loaded with rocks, typically 25 kilograms, up a near vertical slope. Candidates who can't complete the course in under 48 minutes are eliminated. Most don't finish at all. Those who pass face endurance marches through mountain terrain that would challenge Olympic athletes. Swimming trials in rivers fed by Himalayan snowmelt. Pull-ups, sit-ups, sprints, each with cut-off times that grow more demanding at every stage. The medical examination rejects candidates for conditions they never knew they had. Slight asymmetries in their limbs, minor variations in their vision, hearts that beat a few times too fast under stress. Roughly 98% of applicants fail. But the real selection isn't physical. The British Army has learned over 2 centuries that strong backs are common. What's rare is something harder to measure. A combination of loyalty, intelligence, humour, and what the recruiting officers call cheerfulness in adversity. The Gurkha ethos. The willingness to suffer without complaint, to follow orders without hesitation, and to fight with controlled aggression that terrifies enemies who mistake small stature and constant smiles for weakness. The young men who survive selection leave villages they may not see again for years. They send money home to families, sometimes half their pay or more, supporting parents and siblings and communities that depend on their success. They learn English, often as a second or third language. They adapt to military customs that evolved thousands of miles from anything in their experience. They become, in a very real sense, professional strangers, Nepalese by birth, British by uniform, belonging fully to neither world. And they do all of this with a professionalism that makes them, pound for pound, among the most effective infantry soldiers anywhere on Earth. That's who was sailing toward the Falkland Islands in the southern autumn of 1982. The 1st Battalion, 7th Duke of Edinburgh's own Gurkha Rifles, 17GR, received their orders in early May. They were stationed in the United Kingdom at the time, part of the normal rotation that moved Gurkha battalions between postings in Hong Kong, Brunei and Britain. The Falklands hadn't been on anyone's deployment schedule. Neither had war. The invasion had come on 2nd April 1982, when Argentine forces landed on islands that most British people couldn't find on a map. General Leopoldo Galtieri, not president, dictator, head of a military junta that had murdered thousands of its own citizens in the Dirty War, had calculated that Britain wouldn't fight for a remote South Atlantic territory. He was wrong. Margaret Thatcher assembled a naval task force within days, and what Galtieri imagined as a quick political victory became a shooting war. The 17th GR joined the 5th Infantry Brigade, which departed for the South Atlantic in mid-May aboard the requisitioned cruise liner Queen Elizabeth II. Unlike the 3rd Commando Brigade, which had trained extensively for Arctic warfare and amphibious operations, the 5th Brigade was assembled more hastily. Scots Guards, Welsh Guards, Gurkhas, a mixed formation that would see some of the heaviest fighting of the war. The voyage south took weeks. The QE2 wasn't a warship. It was a luxury liner pressed into service as a troop transport. The Gurkhas trained on deck when weather permitted, ran through their drills in converted lounges, and studied maps of islands none of them had ever seen. At Ascension Island, they transferred to other vessels for the final leg. The South Atlantic in winter is not gentle. Seas that would make civilian passengers vomit were simply part of the journey. The Gurkhas had never fought in terrain quite like what awaited them. The hills of Nepal are vertical. The Falklands are horizontal. Endless stretches of peat bog and tussock grass, punctuated by rocky ridges. The cold was familiar. Nepal in winter can be brutal. But the wet was different. Everything in the Falklands was wet. The ground, the air, the inside of your boots, no matter how carefully you'd waterproofed them. Sleeping bags that were damp when you crawled into them and damper when you crawled out. But the Gurkhas adapted. That's what they do. The weapons they carried were familiar. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, the British version of the Belgian FN-FAL. 7.62mm rounds, 20-round magazine, effective range of 600 meters. The Argentines carried essentially the same weapon. Their version was called the FAL as well. In terms of infantry rifles, the two sides were evenly matched. The difference was what the Gurkhas carried in addition to their SLRs, the kukri. Every Gurkha soldier carries one. A curved knife, roughly 18 inches long, with a distinctive forward-sweeping blade that looks nothing like European knives. The design is ancient. Similar blades appear in Macedonian history, and the kukri may have arrived in Nepal with Alexander's armies. The curve isn't decorative. It concentrates the force of a chopping blow into a smaller area, delivering cutting power that straight blades can't match. A properly wielded kukri can take off a limb. The kukri isn't just a weapon, it's a tool, perfectly functional as a machete, a skinning knife, a fire starter, a general-purpose blade for everything from preparing food to building shelters. Gurkhas use their kukris constantly for practical tasks. The legend that a Gurkha must draw blood every time he unsheathes his kukri is almost certainly apocryphal. But the legend persists because it captures something true about the psychology of the weapon. In close combat, the kukri is devastating. And the sight of a Gurkha drawing his kukri has been known to end confrontations before they begin. The reputation precedes the reality. The Argentines on the Falkland Islands had heard about the kukris. By early June, as British forces consolidated their beachhead at San Carlos and began the long march toward Port Stanley, the Gurkhas were proving their worth in conditions that tested everyone. They moved light and fast. They complained about nothing. They maintained their cheerfulness in adversity, even as other units struggled with the terrain, the cold, and the endless wetness that seeped into everything. And then came the 8th of June, 1982. The Welsh Guards had been moved by sea toward Bluff Cove, attempting to outflank Argentine positions for the final push on Port Stanley. The Royal Fleet auxiliary ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram lay at anchor in Port Pleasant, carrying troops who hadn't yet disembarked. They were sitting targets. Argentine Air Force A-4 Skyhawks found them at approximately 2 p.m. local time. The pilots had evaded the Sea Harrier Combat Air Patrol. The famous Black Death was elsewhere, unable to prevent what came next. Bombs penetrated Sir Galahad's tank deck, where the Welsh Guards were sheltering. The explosions ignited fuel and ammunition. 48 men died. Most of them Welsh Guards. Young men from Pontypridd and Merthyr Tydfil, from families where military service passed from father to son. Many more suffered burns so severe they would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. Simon Weston, a Welsh Guardsman who survived with burns to 46% of his body, would become the public face of the disaster. The Gurkhas absorbed the news and kept marching. They had their own battle coming. The road to Port Stanley ran through a series of hills that the Argentines had fortified in depth. Mount Longdon fell to 3 para in brutal fighting. 2 sisters fell to 45 commando. Mount Harriet fell to 42 commando. Each battle was a night assault against dug-in positions, exhausted men fighting through darkness and cold against defenders who knew they were losing but hadn't stopped fighting. Mount Tumbledown was next, a steep, rocky ridge that dominated the western approaches to the capital. The Scots Guards would attack from the north. The 1/7th GR would assault the western end. The attack was scheduled for June 13, 1982. It was supposed to begin at 9 p.m. Delays pushed it back, and back again. The Gurkhas waited in their assembly areas. The wind off the South Atlantic cut through everything. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the Scots Guards had gone in. The sounds of their battle drifted across the darkness. Gunfire, explosions, the crack of rifles that sounded nothing like training exercises. The Scots Guards were taking casualties, heavy ones. The Gurkhas waited. That's one of the hardest parts of soldiering, the waiting. Being wound tight for combat that hasn't started yet. Knowing that men are dying a few hundred meters away while you sit in the cold and listen. When the order finally came, the Gurkhas moved. The terrain on their axis of attack was different than expected. Rocky outcrops that channeled movement, ground that looked passable on maps but proved treacherous in the dark. The resistance they encountered was sporadic rather than sustained. Some Argentine positions had been abandoned. Others held men who surrendered quickly once they realized who was coming. The Gurkhas did what Gurkhas have always done. They moved quietly. They struck quickly. They kept pushing forward until there was nothing left to push against. The kukris stayed mostly sheathed. Most combat was at rifle range, not knife range. But the Argentines didn't know that. The fear of the kukris was its own weapon. And then, on June 14, 1982, before the sun had fully risen over Port Stanley, the Argentines surrendered. The war was over. 74 days after it began, 649 Argentine dead, 255 British dead. An archipelago restored to the country that had held it since 1833. The Gurkhas were disappointed. That word shows up again and again in veteran accounts. Disappointed. Not angry. Gurkhas are professionals, and professionals don't question the end of hostilities. But disappointed in a way that reveals something important about military culture. They had sailed 8,000 miles. They had marched across the islands in conditions that would break lesser soldiers. They had waited through delay after delay for their chance to prove what they could do. They had been ready, completely, genuinely ready for the kind of close-quarters combat that would have favoured their skills and their weapons. And then it was over. "We came all this way," one Gurkha is reported to have said, "and it is finished?" The stories that emerged after the war capture this frustration. Veterans tell of Gurkhas wanting to continue the advance, of officers having to explain that the Argentines had surrendered, that the fighting was done. Some versions of these stories portray the Gurkhas as bloodthirsty, eager for combat beyond what the situation required. That's not quite right. What the stories actually capture is the peculiar letdown of a warrior culture trained to a razor's edge for a battle that ended before it could be fully joined. The Gurkhas weren't disappointed because they wanted to kill. They were disappointed because they'd been denied the chance to demonstrate, at the highest stakes, what they were capable of. There's a difference. The Argentine conscripts who faced the Gurkhas, or who expected to and were spared by the surrender, told their own stories afterward. Stories about the terror of waiting for the night attacks, about hearing movement in the darkness and not knowing whether it was wind or death approaching, about rumours of curved knives and smiling faces that spread through the lines in the final days. The psychological warfare worked. The British had spread stories about the Gurkhas, some true, some exaggerated, knowing that reputation can be as powerful as firepower. Argentine morale was already crumbling by mid-June. The prospect of facing the Gurkhas accelerated the collapse. You can debate whether using reputation as a weapon is somehow dishonourable. The Gurkhas themselves didn't create their legend through propaganda. They created it through 167 years of fighting and winning. The fear was earned. The 1st Battalion, 7th Duke of Edinburgh's own Gurkha Rifles, returned from the Falklands to the same routine they'd left. Training, exercises, the endless preparation for the next conflict. The regiment's service in the South Atlantic became another line in a history that stretched back to 1816. Another campaign ribbon on dress uniforms, worn at ceremonies where old men remember young men they used to be. Some of those Gurkhas stayed in service for decades afterward. The brigade continued deploying wherever the British Army needed them. The Gulf War in 1991, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq. The Falklands veterans moved up through the ranks or returned to Nepal when their service ended, carrying pensions and memories back to villages in the hills. In Nepal, Falklands veterans hold a particular status. The war was brief, but it was real combat. A rarity in the decades between the end of the Borneo confrontation in 1966 and the beginning of sustained operations in Afghanistan after 2001. Men who fought at Tumbledown can speak of something that younger Gurkhas, even those who've served multiple tours in Helmand province, recognise as belonging to a different era. A time when wars still had clear beginnings and endings, when surrenders happened on specific days, when you could point to a moment and say, there, that's when it was over. The Falklands War gets remembered for the Sea Harriers and the Exocet missiles and the Sheffield burning in the South Atlantic. It gets remembered for Margaret Thatcher's political resurrection and Argentina's return to democracy. It gets remembered for the 21-0 kill ratio, a statistic that measures one dimension of the air war and ignores everything else. This war was terrible for both sides. The phrase applies to the Gurkhas too, though not in the obvious way. The terribleness for them wasn't in casualties, they suffered relatively few. It was in the peculiar tragedy of being exactly what was needed and then not being needed enough. Of sailing 8,000 miles and marching across frozen peat bogs and waiting in the darkness for an assault that was overtaken by events. The Welsh Guards who burned at Bluff Cove would have traded anything for that kind of disappointment. So would the sailors on Sheffield and Coventry and the other ships that Argentine pilots sent to the bottom. The Gurkhas' frustration was the frustration of survivors, of men who were ready to pay any price, and found the price had already been paid by others. The Argentine pilots who flew those missions, the ones who sank the ships and killed the Welsh Guards and made the 21-0 ratio seem irrelevant, were skilled professionals too. British veterans have said so repeatedly in the decades since. They were exceptionally skilled fighter pilots, trapped by a dictatorship that had manufactured a war for political survival. The pilots of both sides had more in common with each other than with the politicians who sent them to kill. The same might be said of the infantry. The Argentine conscripts freezing in trenches around Port Stanley were victims of Galtieri's junta as much as anyone. Young men dragged into a war they didn't choose, facing professional soldiers from Nepal who trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of fight. The Gurkhas were ready. The Argentines weren't. And then the surrender came, and everyone went home, those who were still alive to go. There's no neat moral to this story, no lesson that resolves the tension between what was expected and what happened. The Gurkhas served with the same professionalism they'd shown for 167 years, and they would continue serving with that professionalism in every deployment that followed. Their disappointment in the Falklands didn't diminish their commitment. It was simply a moment, preserved in regimental law, when the reality of war failed to match its anticipation. The Argentine conscripts who expected to face the Gurkhas got lucky. The surrender on June 14, 1982, saved lives on both sides, including lives that would have been lost if the fighting had continued into the streets of Port Stanley. Whatever frustration the Gurkhas felt was a small price for the young Argentines who went home instead of dying in the darkness. War is terrible for both sides, and sometimes the most terrible thing is how arbitrary it all is. Who lives? Who dies? Who fights? Who waits? Who arrives too late? And who arrives just in time? The Gurkhas were ready to pay any price demanded of them, and the price demanded turned out to be patience and anticlimax rather than blood. They handled it the way they handle everything, with professionalism, with that famous cheerfulness in adversity, with quiet acceptance that comes from understanding your place in something larger than yourself, and with just a little disappointment that the war ended before they could show everyone what they already knew. They were ready. The Falklands documentaries will keep focusing on the Sea Harriers and the Exocet missiles and the burning ships. They'll keep citing the 21-0 kill ratio as proof of something simple and triumphant. But underneath that narrative is another story, of Nepalese soldiers who sailed to the end of the earth, of a warrior culture that waited in the darkness for a battle that never fully came, of men who smiled at the prospect of combat and then had to smile instead at victory. The 17GR came home. The regiment's colours now carry the battle honour Falkland Islands 1982 alongside all the others, the names of places where Gurkhas fought and died and proved what they were made of. Tumbledown is one more line in a history that began when General Ochterlony watched the defenders of Kalanga march out with their weapons and their honour intact. They've been earning that respect ever since. If you want more stories like this, the ones that get left out of the headlines, subscribe. There's always another layer underneath the history you think you know.